Hi, I'm Tom Gilson, Associate Editor of Against the Grain, and I'm here at the Charleston Conference at the Francis Marion Hotel in the Penthouse Suites, and I'm here to talk to Dr. James L.W. West, who is the Edwin Erle Sparks Professor of English at Penn State University, as well as being the Director of Penn State's Center for the History of the Book. Dr. West, welcome to the Penthouse.
Thank you. Pleased to be here.
We are delighted to have you. One of the first things I wanted to ask you, you're best known as the editor of books by three very well-known American authors: Theodore Dreiser, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and probably most importantly, William Styron. What led to your interest in these authors?
Well, initially I became interested in them by teaching their works, and I found that my students responded well to them, and I myself was moved by their writings. They're really very different kinds of authors. They all write fiction. They're all best known as novelists. But you have to have that kind of commitment, a sort of connection through the heart to a writer if you're going to devote a great deal of your life to the study of the author's works and career. So I certainly did have that. So that still do.
I love their work, basically.
That's right.
Yeah. You had and I've read that you had a personal relationship with William Styron. Is that correct?
I did. We were not close friends, and in fact, there was a certain distance there, and I think he and I both liked it that way, because after all, I was tromping around in his life, and you never knew what I was going to turn up. But he didn't seem worried about it. I asked him one time, I said, if someone was looking about in my past, I might have a little trepidation. And Styron said, no, you go ahead and write your book. I've never done anything of which I'm truly ashamed. And I would have to say, having written the biography now, that this was true. This is true. It also helped a great deal to have the subject of the biography there. You could observe the person. You could see how he interacted with other people in different situations. And finally, when you write a biography, it's important that you must have permissions from the author, or if the author is gone, from the author's heirs, to quote from such things as diaries, unpublished letters, journals, manuscripts, and things of that sort. I had Styron right there, and he gave me permission to use anything that I wanted to. So that was a great convenience and very helpful. I'm still grateful to him.
That was actually going to be another question, is how it impacted your work, but it sounds like it was just overall a very positive experience for you in terms of your work with Styron.
It was. I truly enjoyed writing that biography because I was writing narrative. Much of what you write in academic work is exegesis, it's argumentative. This was telling a story, and I enjoyed it a great deal. I miss working on that biography. On the other hand, I'm glad I finished it and published it while he was still alive so that he could see it.
I can imagine. I imagine he was very pleased with the results.
I think so. He never actually told me that he was, but I sensed that he was pleased. As I say, we had a rather formal relationship, and both of us were most comfortable that way.
Well, from working with authors like Styron, and how did you move into your interest in bibliography and the history of the book?
Actually, the interest in bibliography and history of the book came first. Like many students of literature, I became impatient with abstractions, with what I took to be simply saying clever things about works of literature. I wanted evidence, and I found that I truly enjoyed working in archives with authors' papers, their manuscripts, their letters. It was almost as if you could look over their shoulders as they were in the act of composition. So that came first. I've also always had a curiosity about the publishing industry because it's so very important in recording the history of a given time, the products of a particular society, its cultural output, if you will. And so I felt I needed to study the means by which the writing made it through into a saleable product, which then reached readers.
Currently, you're the director of the Center for the History of the Book at Penn State. How did you get involved with the Center for the History of the Book?
I thought it was a good idea to have such a center, and I went to my dean, and she said, here's a little money, print up some letterhead, and you're ready to go. Very enlightened dean. But what I wanted to do was to start a group there at Penn State in which we taught book history, in which we invited lecturers to come to campus, and then maybe most importantly, in which we published a series of books with Penn State Press in the history of the book. Book history, or l'histoire du livre, it sounds classier in French, you know. The history of the book is a big, broad umbrella that covers a lot of different kinds of research. It's a messy field, which I like about it, still forming itself. And so I've truly enjoyed the teaching and listening to the lectures, and also working with authors to see their manuscripts into print in the book series.
I understand the library is involved. Is one of the sponsors of the center, is that right?
Yes, that's right. And as a matter of fact, the connections between the library and the University Press, which would seem to be very natural, that doesn't happen at all universities, but Penn State has been very good about that sort of thing. So the library and the press are close together too. And the library understands that the history of books involves the history of libraries, the storage of books, making them accessible, and particularly in the United States, the public library movement, which has been important to our development as a society.
I think that's particularly true with the immigrant societies early on in the 1880s, 1890s. And
Very much so, very much so. And I think continues to be important today. We take it for granted, of course, but if you live in other countries, you realize that access to books in the way that you have that access in this country is by no means something you find all around the globe.
As you say, we take it for granted and don't realize how fortunate we are.
That's right.
You've written a book entitled Making the Archives Talk. That is such a great title, but what does that phrase mean to you?
Well, thanks. I rather like that title too. I took the title from another book called Making the Mummies Walk, which was written by the director of, I guess it's the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. What he wanted to do was not to have inert exhibits, the mummies just lying there, but having them out and walking around and bringing people in, so to speak. In this case, though, the kinds of materials you find in archives, letters, diaries, personal papers, they tell stories, but you don't allow the archives to talk. You have to make them talk. That is, you have to take the inert material and shape it into a narrative, which often can go in a number of different directions. So I think I wanted to emphasize the role of the scholar as some sort of combination of historian, literary critic, and biographer, narrator in the use of archival material.
And there's a level of creativity in all of that, I would imagine.
Quite a lot, actually. I remember after I published the biography of William Styron, I sat down one day and I asked myself in a given paragraph, how did you know that? And how did you know that? Where did you find that? And I realized, somewhat to my shock, that some of it I just kind of made up. You know? And imagination plays a big role in how you interpret a person's life. And no two biographers will do it the same way.
Well, that's why there are multiple biographies of the same person. There are different perspectives and different takes on it.
That's very true, yes.
With the continuing or the growing reliance, I should say, on e-text, how do you think that's going to affect future archival researchers?
The first thing you think of is what happens to editions of letters. With the writers I've studied, there are these wonderful archives of letters that they wrote to others, and then that others wrote to them. That's how people communicated. Now, so many writers do this on email. Likewise, with Fitzgerald, for instance, you have several stages of manuscript and typescript through which his literary works pass before they go into print. But now, books and literary works are produced digitally, and you make your revisions, and the old version just sort of vanishes. Unless we can figure out how to recover those early versions from hard drives, then I think we've probably lost something.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of thinking about all of it in terms of the impacts. There's going to be material that's just lost. There's not much you can do about it. This morning, I'd like to just get back to the history of book publishing, because this morning in your talk, you talked about controversies, particularly over book pricing. There's really nothing new about that. There's kind of a history of that. That's almost a tradition within the book industry. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I noticed from the very beginning of book publishing, and by this I mean going back into, I suppose, the medieval period, and particularly once you get into 17th and 18th century, there were always price wars. There was always a great deal of friction between publishers, booksellers, and others over how much someone had to pay for a given book. And I noticed this running all through the 19th century and in the 20th century. The problem is, if prices are not maintained at a level that the publisher sets, no one can pay the bills. The bookshop owners can't pay the publishers can't pay the authors and the printers, the authors and the printers can't pay the people they owe money to, and the whole business becomes stagnant. There's no cash flow, therefore there's no working capital, and so forth. So a number of the recent controversies remind me very much of earlier controversies in which price control was the problem. The ones I talked about this morning were the failure of a net book agreement in the United States, and I also talked about the coming of book clubs, which are a form of price cutting, and then the success of paperback publishing in 1939 and beyond. All of those involve maintaining the prices at a particular level.
What do you think that this history tells us about the current controversies about e-book pricing with Amazon and the big five publishers and Apple?
Those controversies tell us that the price is never stable, and it never has been, and there will always be someone who wants to undercut the price. So what publishers have to do, with or without the help of the law, is to try to bolster those prices and in effect create a sort of monopoly. The problem is that in the United States, being a broad popular democracy, no special privileges are given to book publishing because of its cultural importance. It has to compete out there with all of the other companies that are manufacturing screwdrivers and are selling peanut butter and automobile tires. So there's really no privilege given to our publishers. Therefore, they must be more inventive and gamble more on big sellers and bestsellers in order to keep the money flowing.
Do you think it tells us anything about future business models for the book industry?
Probably so, yes. I think that publishers are going to have to learn to adjust even more to these new methods of distribution than they have before. Exactly what they'll come up with, I can't say. I'm not a publisher, I'm an academic, and so I have the luxury of sitting back and sort of commenting on things. But I have every confidence that publishers will meet the challenge, partly because books and literature are such a precious commodity, and there's always a demand for them. So I think they can count on their audience.
Switching gears just a tad, what's your observation in terms of the library's role throughout the history of book publishing?
Libraries have always been and continue to be repositories for the products of the intellectual products of a society, for history and thought and argument, all of which continue to go on and on and on. We think things are current, we think we have them in our memory, and yet a few years pass and you must have a library as a repository. So there's a symbiosis and interdependence, obviously, always has been, between libraries and publishers. Societies, though, and maybe universities in particular, need to recognize not only the immediate use of their resources by students and faculty, but the long-term necessity of collecting and forming the kinds of bodies of information that later people will want.
And if we think in terms of the future, with all the e-books, all the open access that's going on, the self-publishing, how do you see the library and the book industries adjusting to those changes?
I think by becoming assiduous about creating not only repositories for the digital records, but saving the machines that will play them, will make them available to us. That's already a big problem, you know, and we almost need museums of old computers and other kinds of machines that will play those records unless they are regularly updated. So that's the kind of thing that social upheaval might interrupt, and librarians will have to be very careful to keep things current.
And I guess they and publishers still function as gatekeepers of our cultural and intellectual identities.
Very much so, yes. Really, it's always been possible to publish something called a book. You can do it off your kitchen table. Always have been able to do that. But I do think that publishers have access to modes of distribution and sales, and also access to libraries in ways that private people do not have. And another thing that publishers will be very good at, when they find writers who are self-publishing who are quite good, then the publishers will co-opt them and will bring them in and will begin to manage their work for them in such a way as they can really reach a big audience.
How about your business, literary scholarship? How do you think all these innovations, the e-texts and all the different open access, all these things, how will it affect your business?
Well, already in my business, the literary monograph is on life support. And whether it will continue, I really can't say. I think I'm glad that I'm retiring soon. I do think there's a place for the monograph. We have been saying for years that what we must do is to get our students to write about something with broader cultural appeal, rather than these little narrow topics that they tend to concentrate on, at least for the dissertation. Whether we'll be up to the task, I don't know. But if the monograph does pass away, there will be other ways to publish one's work. And the wonderful thing about it is that if you publish on the internet, you have almost instant access to millions and millions of people, many more than will buy a book from a university press.
It really has made communication to an entire world. It's instantaneous.
Very true, yes.
We usually like to ask one ending question, and that's, in a sense, to kind of maybe push you on the spot a little bit, but we were wondering if you were sitting in the interviewer's chair, what question would you ask yourself?
I think I would ask, how do I think students of the future will learn?
Excellent. That's an excellent question.
How will they acquire information? We have to assume that they will be as curious as students have always been, but how will their information come to them? I had the experience this past spring of teaching online for the first time, and I grumped around about it, and I thought I wasn't going to enjoy it. And I found that I really did like it, that you can establish a relationship with student online. You don't even really need to Skype. You just communicate in the way that you would through normally through email. And the professor-student relationship is still established there. And the wonderful thing, though, is that I had students in Germany. I had one in Afghanistan, someone in the military. I had one in Massachusetts, another in California. And you really can teach in your pajamas, which is quite nice, actually. But I've always thought of teaching as throughout my career as a ceremonial act. You go at a particular time, 2 or 3 times a week, to a classroom. You dress the part, the students sit there, you lecture, you talk, and then you interact with the students, but they have to be physically present. So I rather like online education. I think it has tremendous momentum. What I worry about is whether we'll still be able to train students to penetrate deeply into a single topic rather than to just pick up bits and pieces here and there. But that's always been something that you've had to train your students to do.
Well, I think the relationship with students is something librarians need to be concerned about as well. It's a question that we need to be asking ourselves too.
Very much so, and faculty and librarians need to work together on these kinds of matters.
Definitely. Well, Dr. West, I really want to thank you for coming in and talking to us. I've had a great time just chatting. And
well, thank you, Tom. I've enjoyed it myself.
Great. Thank you.